you have three possible outcomes, of which one is widely considered to be about as close to... I'm looking at polling. The idea of a Labour overall majority is in third for likelihood.
I was speaking to somebody very senior within the Labour Party who thinks there has been enough of a surge this week to make that an outside chance of happening.
I'm going to suggest it wasn't Jonathan Ashworth.
No, it wasn't Jonathan Ashworth.
And in second place, on judging from the numbers, would be the no overall majority.
Yes.
And then in first place, Boris Johnson secures a majority. And then, of course, you have the variations on that result according to how many seats he's got. How many seats does he need to be home and dry?
He only needs a majority of one or two.
Because there's no rebel left. Everyone has been expunged from the party.
Because there was another point to removing the whip from those 21 Conservatives.
Many of them have safe seats.
Nicholas Soames and Dominic Grieve, and there was an ulterior motive to doing that, and that is that they were no longer Conservatives. If they wanted to pledge loyalty and vote against what was then the Letwin Amendment to make it obligatory for the government to pass all of the legislation necessary before we leave the European Union, that was their chance to come back. 10, 15 of them didn't take it. And then we ended up in a situation where there were these constituencies vacant for Conservative candidates, and Boris Johnson filled them. The Conservative Party has filled them quite easily, but obviously, but with the condition that they are signing up to his deal with the European Union, and therefore he only needs a majority of one or two. But if he gets only a majority of one or two, his premiership is likely to come unstuck fairly early on in his tenure, because he will not be able to do anything of significance that would upset even the smallest marginal group within his party. Everything he'll want to do for the next 4.5 years will have to have the consensus of his party, and then that will spell real trouble for the June the 30th, when the UK has to tell the European Union whether we want to extend the transition period, and real trouble at the end of that transition period unless he can sign up a good trade deal with the European Union that satisfies the ERG. So if you're asking me about what number he needs, I'd say he needs around 40 to 50, and then the quote, Get Brexit Done, has a chance of becoming reality, and they can close the Pandora's box on Brexit.
Or get Brexit started, actually, because it hasn't actually started.
But
that wouldn't be a very good campaign, so I understand what you mean.
The point I make is that...
Get the withdrawal agreement through.
Brexit is like the 100 metres in the Olympics right now. Everybody's talking about it, everybody's focused on it, but there was a point in time, about 7 or 8 years ago, when it was ping-pong. And it wasn't what everybody turned up to talk about. It wasn't dominating the front pages. And actually Brexit can go back to being a fairly techie issue around this trade agreement with the European Union. We're not going to worry too much with trade deals. This would be the thinking of somebody like Philip Hammond, because actually we do want to have free and clear access to the European Union without the French or the Dutch or the Belgians putting up trade barriers at the ports in Northern Europe. And that's the point.
If there's no overall majority, Johnson gets first crack at forming a government.
As long as he's the largest party.
So that would involve the Conservatives having more votes than any other party, even if they've got fewer votes than all the other parties.
Fewer seats. Let's talk about seats.
Sorry, I mean seats. Oh, crikey, look at the difference between seats and votes. Just ask Donald Trump. Yeah. The bottom line is that he gets first dibs, but
if he's the largest party.
If he's the largest party, the largest number of seats.
Remember the deal with the DUPs? Yes. He can't turn to the DUP now.
Well, he can if they believe him when he says that there's no border in the Irish Sea. No, I know, don't spoil it. I was building up some tension.
But it's...
So
there's nobody he can turn to at the moment to form a... John Curtice, Professor John Curtice, who knows everything about everything when it comes to elections, was very clear on this. Boris Johnson needs an overall majority. He can't rely on anybody else to form a coalition. So what you'd probably end up with is Boris Johnson going to the palace, saying that he could command a majority in the House of Commons, coming back to the House of Commons and then immediately losing a vote of confidence, and then Jeremy Corbyn probably being given a go.
That is then just a technicality, given what you've just said. Even if Boris Johnson secures more seats than any other party, if the other parties combined have more seats, he's got no chance of forming a government.
It'd be very difficult.
I'd imagine he would take. If he could.
How do you? Sorry.
Well, he'd go to the palace and say,
give me a chance to form a government. I'm
Yes.
the largest party.
Yes.
To which the Queen would, given our unwritten constitution,
Are you
uncodified
telling
constitution,
the truth this time? She might say.
and Boris Johnson will say, yes, I can command a majority, and then he would go back and he would try and command a majority, and if the numbers were to hold true and people were to vote according to their party allegiance and in line with their party whips, then that would inevitably fail to be true, and he would lose a vote of confidence.
And then the leader of whatever party secured the
smaller
second
party.
highest number
Yes.
of seats
And then
gets
they
to
would-
go to the palace.
And then as long as they can then prove, they would then get the chance, and they would have to, there'd have to be some sort of agreement, rainbow coalition, confidence and supply agreement with the Liberal Democrats and the SNP from Jeremy Corbyn, and they may, of course, attach conditions to that. There's been talk, Bob Kerslake earlier on, who's, of course, former head of the civil service and has been advising John McDonnell, was saying, well, actually, Jeremy Corbyn as as leader of the Labour Party and potential Prime Minister, his position in that post may be part of those negotiations, and that they may ask for him to step aside and put somebody else in charge. And then whoever is leader of the Labour Party would get to go to the palace and say, well, I can form a majority in the House of Commons, and then come back and try and do that. And if they were to do that, then, of course, it would be on the dominant policy, given Labour are the largest party. One would expect, but not necessarily be the case, that they would then try and pass the legislation necessary for a second referendum.
And that would be the deal, really, regardless. I mean, those of us
but
slightly
Jo Swinson has made that shift, hasn't she? Back
she's
from
shifted
revoking
on
Article
pretty
50.
much everything, hasn't
So
she?
she shifted back from revoking Article 50 to saying that they would move very quickly to support a second referendum.
And then the final possibility is that the Labour Party end up with more votes than any other, in which case we're back
More
to
seats than any other.
more seats, than any other, in which case we're back to answer number one, in that Jeremy Corbyn gets first dibs.
Yes.
But it's a different proposition from Boris Johnson, because as things stand, Jeremy Corbyn is at least likely to have SNP and Lib Dem votes in his pocket when he goes to the palace.
Yes, he could have. He would need to be able to. There'd need to be a demonstration that he can. It's not just a question of turning up in the palace and going, Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, I can command a majority in the House of Commons. There would be talks, there'd be negotiations, and that's why the government's already announced, and this happened earlier on in the campaign, that if Boris Johnson wins a majority, we'll have a Queen's speech on December the 17th. If they don't, then the Queen's speech will come back, will happen after Christmas, because, of course, those negotiations will need to take place.